To the ancestors, named and unnamed, who've come before me, to the playground prophets at my back, for all of these things and more, Creator, I give you praise. Dear Marshawn, I've never met you, but ever since I learned a little bit more about your story last year, you've not escaped my mind. You see, like you, I grew up in flyover country, a Black child, the place where thistles and dandelions seep through the cracks of abandoned factories and broken promises. My ancestors migrated here, fleeing the daily terrorism of life in the agrarian South, where Black bodies were seen as chattel, and the cry of baby Shug's holy, "We flesh, we flesh, we flesh," was met with deaf ears who refused to hear. So our peoples boarded buses and trains and cars, following the North Star to what they hoped was a better life. What they found were urban ghettos and the same horrors of racism sung to a different tune. Your peoples landed in Ohio, mine in Illinois. Your friends say you wanted something for the world that the world was not quite ready for, peace and unity. You were fond of saying that you needed a pistol that shoots hope so you could light the hood up. And light it up you did with art and poetry and song and activism. You founded Pursuing the Dream in 2013 to feed the unhoused, not out of a sense of charity or altruism or some messianic complex, but because you knew firsthand what it was like to not know where you were going to sleep that night. You see, when Mike Brown was crucified on an altar of pavement laid bare for the world to see, the brutality inflicted on Black bodies and brown bodies and queer bodies, you answered the call. Alongside your brothers and sisters and siblings in the Ohio Student Association, you organized for justice for Mike and John Crawford and Tamir Rice, a baby assassinated for the crime of playing on a playground. You see, everyone was so blinded by your brightness and the brightness of your star, they could not clearly see the darkness that surrounded you. No one does. They saw the awards, the hometown hero, the red carpets, and the resume, but they did not see you. They could not see the heaviness you were carrying, the weight of death placed on your back. You said on Facebook that day that your demons got the best of you. So you placed steel to temple flesh and pulled, finally free from the pain that enveloped you. Your lifeless body remained on the steps of the Ohio State House, crucified. Testament. Your spirit was finally free from a specific pain that I will never know. I am writing this eulogy for you so that you know even now you're not alone. I too have felt the constant companion of depression. Last year, around the time you died, my mother went into the hospital for the last time. I had the honor of journeying alongside her as she took her final walk towards death after a 14-year battle with cancer. But before we knew where the path was leading, before the word hospice had entered our vocabulary, when we thought her hospital visit was just a temporary one, we had time. One day, as we were waiting for the doctor to come around, she told me a story. Gazing out the window, She recalled that time, that moment when in quiet despair she placed her foot on the accelerator and began to drive down a boat launch ramp into the murky, mud-tinged waters of the Mississippi River. You see, the Mississippi has seen its share of Black death, people striving for freedom. And you told me, Mama, that the voices of the ancestors surrounded you and asked who would take care of your baby. You chose to live for me. It was a sentiment I recognized because at 14 years old, I chose to live for you. When the blade was at my wrist and I thought I could not go on, I thought my mommy would be sad. My mommy would be sad. Marshawn, you are not alone. For heaven is full of angels, angels that I know, who left this world in similar ways as you did. Josephine Chow, Nina Fouché, Matthew Coppell, I say your names. If angels do indeed have wings, I pray they wrap them around you and give you the sense of peace and unity you've never found here. Love, a sister still trying to find herself. Marshawn McCarroll was 23 years old when he died on the steps of the Ohio State House. You see, there's a refrain in the field of mental health that suicide is a permanent fix to a temporary problem. But what happens when the problems that Black and brown bodies like mine, people who exist at the margins, are not faced with temporary problems, but structural problems? That don't go away. You see, in my life, I've found that trauma is real, that it exists throughout the generations, the same way that my mama taught me to be a strong Black woman. She taught me what self-sacrifice looked like to the detriment of her own health. So when we talk about what it means to love the self, how do you love the self when society tells you that you are despised? That blade on my wrist at 14 was the same blade that so many of my friends have picked up. Black bodies, brown bodies, queer bodies, Muslim bodies, seeking a way out. Mama Audre Lorde was right when she said that caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation and an act of political warfare. You see, this very same trauma that many of us live with is political, and thus our healing must be political as well. The elders of the generative somatics movement teach us that trauma lives in our bodies. It is something that we carry with us each and every day. And so the question I have for you, beloved, as we think about this radical, countercultural work of loving the self is how? I believe that first we have to remember the fullness of our stories, not just as a moment of recall, but as a literal remembering, putting back together the full picture of who we are. We are taught to forget. We are a culture that lives in a state of grief that is taught to forget and move on, but each of us carries within us, yes, great joy, but also deep pain. And that pain can be a resource as well. But we cannot begin the radical work of loving the self if we don't know who that self is. If we have not given ourselves enough time, place, consideration to look in the mirror and say, I see you. I love you. I see you. Second, just as our trauma is political, is the stuff for me of 400 years of history, of a stolen people brought to this land, so too must our healing be, like Mama Audra said, a political act. It must be countercultural, even within our movement spaces. I'm a church girl, y'all. I'm a church girl, y'all. And in my tradition, there's only one Messiah. The Messianic complex that we have endowed, the martyrdom complex that we have embedded within our social movements, is the reason why we're dying. The political act, indeed the countercultural act, is to not put oneself up on the mantle for public display, no. It is to be engaged in a collective act of healing, a collective act of care, a collective act knowing that if I need to step back, beloved, someone else will step forward. And that is the work of not just self-care, but communal care. It is within communities and only within communities that we will begin to see ourselves as God has called us to be. I believe what it says in the book of Genesis, that we are all created with a divine spark. And so how can I know me? How can I know the divine? How can I know God without knowing you? That is the work of communal care. That is why the work must never be done alone. Far too often, our mantras of self-love or its cousin self-care becomes about pedicures and manicures. And listen, I am down for all of those things. But who has access to those things? Our care cannot be tied to our ability to pay, cannot be reproduced in a capitalistic cycle that marginalizes many of our bodies and exploits our labor. Finally, beloved, the work, the radical work, the political work of love, of self, is a journey and not a destination. It is a process that we, from time to time, will revisit, whether we're a playground prophet or an elder saint. It is a lifetime of work. It is a lifetime of work. In the book of Mark, Jesus says, there are 2 commandments that I give you. First, to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And second, to love your neighbor as yourself. If we don't know how to love ourselves, we won't be able to love our neighbor. If we don't love our neighbor, this work of revolutionary love will stay stagnant. And there are too many Marchands in the world in need of radical healing. There are too many Marchands in the world in need of a vision of the future. But I do believe we can do it together. Thank you.